Hi, and welcome to Mediation Works. I'm Wendy Lakusta, and I'm here again with my colleague Sharon Sutherland. And we are continuing with our segments on strata disputes. So we have with us today a colleague who we've all worked together a lot over the years. And Sheila Begg, she's a mediator, arbitrator. And Sheila, we want to start talking about long-term festering strata disputes, those painful situations that go on and on. And maybe we could start off with talking a little bit about, could you talk a little bit about what they look like? Like what are the different aspects or dynamics of those kinds of disputes?
Well, ones that have been going on for some time are really difficult because the parties can't really escape them. They're there. When they walk down the hall to go out of the building, take their dog for a walk, go in the elevator, take their garbage out, they're always passing neighbors and hear little whispers, and sometimes no communication. People might drop their eyes or not paying attention. It becomes very uncomfortable for some of them, and some of them are afraid actually to leave their unit because they feel so uncomfortable in this building. That's one that's been going on for quite a long time that hasn't been dealt with.
And it's not that unusual, I think, in the strata. Are there special dynamics in stratas that can cause them to just keep going, or?
I wouldn't necessarily say that, but I think it would be one where either the owner or the person that has the problem hasn't taken it properly to council or executive to say, look, we have this problem, we need it dealt with. So it's ones that they just don't want to talk about, so they don't talk about them. And then they do grow and fester and become really uncomfortable.
So it's when people sweep them under the rug and don't talk about it. When there's no transparency around it, they just tend to grow and grow.
I think that's the way it goes, yes.
Yeah, which I guess is kind of similar with any kind of neighboring dispute. You know, neighborhood, could be almost anything where you just don't want to engage in that conflict, so you let it go and you just get more and more angry.
That's right, and I've seen situations where people have actually made efforts to try to talk to one another, and something goes wrong, that one person isn't available when they should be or something, and it just gets left, and then they get more angry and they start creating stories about each other. And unfortunately, well, we know this is what neighborhoods do. People talk, they talk to each other.
Yeah.
It's like that old thing where somebody tells a story in an ear and the next one goes on, and by the time you get finished, it doesn't sound at all like the original story.
Okay. So it's the broken telephone disputes is what we're talking
about,
right?
Yes.
Yeah. Just one of the things you were saying was, you know, it's when people don't take the steps they could, and you were mentioning kind of going to council or taking things there. So let's say you are an owner and you do have this, whatever the concern is, or something that is bothering you a little bit, and it may be just at that early stage. What are the kinds of things that you should be doing?
Well, I think the most important one is to make a complaint with whatever process is available. So you'd be looking first of all at things like bylaws, any rules that might be established in that particular strata. You may even want to take the time to look at the Strata Act, because there's certain provisions in there that give you the right to raise certain kinds of issues, and your bylaws should have some kind of process in there. Normally, well, not normally, but very often there is a property manager, and you would maybe write out a complaint or a situation to them, or speak to them, or maybe there's a building manager you could speak to. But the point is you have to raise the issue maybe informally to begin with, but then if there isn't any action or any resolution, then you need to commit it to paper and make it something that you present to council or executive and the property manager and say, you know, you've got to do something about this.
And that's after maybe contacting the person is the first step to see if you can resolve it?
Well, thank you. That's what we always suggest that.
Yeah.
That's always, but you know what, we find in these very close-knit circumstances, very often elderly people, they really find that very, very difficult to do. So that's what we usually suggest, maybe speaking to the building manager or whatever, and they might be able to help you in some way to approach the other person. But yes, that's always step number one in all of the processes.
Yeah, I assumed you're taking these steps after trying that.
That's right.
But most people don't like that step one.
No, and sometimes with neighbors, again, it takes all kinds of people to live in these buildings, and sometimes one neighbor will not be as congenial as the next one.
Right. And there may be, real concerns, whether it's safety concerns at a really extreme end in going and approaching, but there are definitely people who will just really be conflict avoiders and see that as just a huge challenge to actually go and say, this is bothering me. So when you're talking about engaging property managers or counsel, it seems to me that what you're really doing is kind of bringing in that third party. And of course, as mediators, that's one of the things we're constantly looking at is how does it change the dynamic of that difficult conversation if there simply is somebody else in the room. So I'm going to kind of turn to you and say, so Sheila, you're a mediator. Do you see ways and means of bringing in people to kind of facilitate some of those difficult discussions, and especially as they've festered and become so toxic that it might be almost impossible to engage?
Well, the thing that a mediator would do, and I think a lot of the property managers are trained to a certain extent on these kind of things, is you try to do what you would in any mediation session to take the sting out of the comment. Try to be accurate. Try to describe it as a behavior rather than pointing a finger at another human being for doing something wrong. So that really helps, I think, so you can characterize the dispute as just being, this is what it is, and this is how it's affecting me.
Yeah, exactly. So would you come in as a mediator normally, or is there an option for another neutral third person to bring in to help?
Well, I've done a lot of mediations for stratas, yes.
Yeah.
They generally, when they say, would I be brought into it, yes, that would be the way to do it. I do actually live in a strata myself. I would never attempt to do my own. With your own neighbors, it gets a little bit more difficult.
Bit of a conflict of interest. Yeah.
Yes, and we've had through, like small claims court, for example, we've had some, unfortunately, that didn't get resolved, and so then they end up in that kind of a setting. And again, where you're a professional mediator, you have to take the sting out of whatever they have to talk. They have to say some things. We don't like them to vent too much, because that can do a lot of damage as well. But on the other hand, if you don't hear the story or hear the misconceptions or the errors or the truth as well, you can't really have a realistic conversation with the parties.
Is it fair to say that when you are having them tell their stories and so on, as you said earlier, like the whispering in the ear and the story spreads, is it quite clear that people have totally different perceptions of what's going on, what the facts are in terms of the dispute?
Well, it can be.
Yeah.
Certainly that's what we're looking for. I can say one situation where there was a meeting to have taken place, and one party who was supposed to be in the meeting had gone fishing, and the other party was outraged, absolutely outraged that they didn't have the courtesy to, call and say. But it turned out, when we dug underneath and got more information, this person was actually a fisherman. And the season had opened.
They were working.
They got a call, they went to work.
Right.
But it was fishing was his work. So.
That just shows.
That's a really obvious one. But there's lots of little subtle things that people somehow ruminate on and build them up into being something bigger than what they actually are.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, just because you were saying, you've done quite a number of strata mediations. I often hear that people just have no idea that mediation is even available. If sometimes it's from people who are on strata council, sometimes it's from owners. And how do people find out about mediation if they're involved in one of these disputes, whether they're an owner or council member, and where do they go to figure out how do we find a mediator who can help us?
Well, the ones that have called me sort of out of the blue have gone onto the Mediate BC website.
Okay.
And that's where they found...
They look on the civil roster.
They look on the civil roster and they find somebody who mentions strata, and that's happened. In other circumstances, some of the property management companies are aware. They have certain people they've been involved with in mediations in certain areas, so they'll put your name forward or whatever. So, but there's, I think, those would be the two main ways of finding out who would be available.
But so an owner thinking that they wanted to trigger a mediation somehow, I'm using that term, because the Strata Property Act refers to arbitration, I find that almost shuts the door to people recognizing that mediation is an option. And so I'm thinking an owner, who hears mediation is an option. Maybe they're watching this and they're hearing Sheila say that, you know, I've done a bunch of these different types of disputes. They might obviously go to the Mediate BC roster. They could presumably, though, it sounds like, also talk to their property manager, maybe talk to counsel, and explore possibilities that way.
That's certainly something they could do, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I would suggest to them anyway. But it's true about the arbitration. It would be so much better if it was actually mentioned, mediation in the Act as well as arbitration.
Right.
Yeah.
Most people that call me don't know the difference, of course.
Yeah.
And so then I have to explain, you know,
Yeah.
how it works and what they're going through. In most cases, when I first get a phone call, people haven't even bothered to read their bylaws. When I say bothered, they may not even know they've got bylaws, unfortunately. So the first step is to try to educate them on their own circumstances and what does it say in your bylaws about these kind of things.
Right. Well, that's great, Sheila. That's really good information. And I'm sure people out there will be really interested to hear, because there's a lot of these kinds of disputes, right?
Yes, there are.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Thanks.
Right, thank you.